Chapter 18. Medical Inquiries and Observations upon the Diseases of the Mind. Chapter 16. Of reverie or absence of mind. This disease is induced by two causes. 1. By the stimulus of ideas of absent subjects being so powerful as to destroy the perception of present objects. And 2. By a torpor of mind so great as not to feel the impressions of surrounding objects upon the sense. It is an inferior or feeble grade of catalepsy. It is more common from the latter than the former cause. It is no objection to this assertion that it sometimes occurs in scholars and in men celebrated for their great literary attainments. A capacity for acquiring knowledge is a cheap endowment, and differs widely from that capacity which enables a man not only to acquire knowledge from books, but to create it by observation and reflection, and to apply it to the useful purposes of life. The following account of a clergyman who died a few years ago, extracted from a late periodical work, will serve to exhibit the nature and extent of this intellectual disease from the latter cause that was mentioned. Mr. George Harvest, minister O.F. Thames Ditton, was one of the most absent men of his time. He was a lover of good eating, almost a gluttony, and was further remarkable as a great fisherman, very negligent in his dress, and a believer in ghosts. In his youth he was contracted to a daughter of the Bishop of London. But on his wedding day, being gudgeon fishing, he overstayed the canonical hour, and the lady, justly offended at his neglect, broke off the match. He had at that time an estate of 300 per annum, but from inattention and absence suffered his servants to run him in debt so much that it was soon spent. It is said that his maid frequently gave balls to her friends and fellow servants of the neighborhood, and persuaded her master that the noise he heard was the effect of wind. In the latter part of his life no one would lend or let him a horse. As he frequently lost his beast from under him, or at least out of his hand, it being his practice to dismount and lead his horse, putting the bridle under his arm, which the horse sometimes shook off, and sometimes it was taken off by the boys, and the parson seen drawing his bridle after him. Sometimes he would purchase a pennyworth of shrimps, and put them in his waistcoat pocket among tobacco, worms, gentles for fishing, and other trumpery. These he often carried about him till they stunk, so as to make his presence almost insufferable. I once saw such a melange turned out of his pot by the Dowager Lady Pembroke. With all these peculiarities, he was a man of some classical learning, and a deep metaphysician, though generally reckoned a little cracked. Such was his absence and distraction that he frequently used to forget the prayer days and to walk to his church with his gun, to see what could have assembled the people there. In company, he never put the bottle round, but always filled when it stood opposite to him, so that he very often took half a dozen glasses running. That he alone was drunk, and the rest of the company sober is not, therefore, be wondered at. One day, Mr. Harvest, being in a punt on the river Thames with Mr. Osto, began to read a beautiful passage in some Greek author, and throwing himself backwards in an ecstasy, fell into the water, whence he was with difficulty fished out. Once, being to preach before the clergy at the Visitation, he had 3 sermons in his pocket. Some wags got possession of them, mixed the leaves, and sewed them all up as one. Mr. Harvest began his sermon, and soon lost the thread of his discourse and got confused, but nevertheless continued, till he had preached out first all the churchwardens, and next the clergy, who thought he was taken mad. It is possible moderate depletion, succeeded by constant and noisy company, might produce in the mind a predominance of impressions from present objects over those of the ideas of absent subjects. Stimulants, particularly such as act upon the brain and nervous system, would probably be useful when the disorder arises from torpor of mind or insensibility of the senses. Chapter 19. Medical Inquiries and Observations upon the Diseases of the Mind. Chapter 17. On derangement of the passions. The passions have been divided into 2 great classes. 1, such as are intended to impel us to real or supposed good, and 2, such as are intended to defend us from real or supposed evil. The former are objects of desire, the latter of aversion. Those of them which are most subject to derangement or to an unreasonable and morbid excess are love, grief, fear, and anger. After mentioning the symptoms of their diseases and their remedies, I shall consider that morbid phenomena of joy, envy, malice, and hatred, and conclude the chapter with a few remarks upon the torpor of the passions of love. This passion, which was implanted in the human breast for the purpose of bringing the sexes together, and thereby increasing their happiness, becomes a disease only where it is disappointed in its object. The symptoms of love, when it creates disease, are sighing, wakefulness, perpetual talking, or silence upon the subject of the object beloved, and a predilection to solitude, where these symptoms do not discover its existence. It may be known in a man by blushing and an increased frequency of pulse when the name of the person beloved is mentioned, and in a woman, according to La Bruyere, by her constantly looking at the man she loves when in company, or never looking at him at all. It is known further in a woman by her retiring to decorate herself upon the appearance of the man in company whom she loves. It always renders a woman awkward, but it polishes the manners of men. The effects of unsuccessful love are dyspepsia, hysteria, hypochondriasis, fever, and madness. The last has sometimes induced suicide, while all the others have now and then ended in death. The remedies for this disease, when accompanied with fever or great excitement in the brain or any other part of the system, should be 1. Bleeding, blistering, and the other remedies for similar states of the system from other causes. It is remarkable that persons who have been cured of the diseases from love by these remedies recover without feeling any affection for the persons they have loved. This was the case with one of the princes of Condé. He complained in this state of mind that his physicians had drawn off all his love for his mistress by their depleting remedies. 2. Ovid advises what he calls a bynum amicam, that is, a new mistress for unsuccessful love. I have known this remedy to succeed in several instances. The sincerity of a former attachment is often called in question by a sudden translation of the affections to a second mistress, but without any foundation. Indeed, it proves its sincerity, for its ardor admits of no other cure. 3. The same master of the subject of love, Ovid, advises an unsuccessful lover to find out and dwell upon all the bad qualities and defects in person and accomplishments of his mistress. If she have a bad voice, says he, press her to sing. If she touch a musical instrument clumsily, beg her to expose herself by playing upon one of them. 4. The company of the person beloved should be carefully avoided. A voyage or journey should opt the mind. 315 be advised in this case, for absence has been justly styled the tomb of love. The company of strangers, by checking all conversation about the person beloved, prevents the passion being cherished by it. 5. Constant employment will aid absence as a remedy for hopeless love. The more that employment interests the understanding, the more completely it will have that effect. The disease is more than half cured when the distressed lover ceases to think of the object of his affection. 6. As hope and love are born together, so they can only die together. Uncommon pains, therefore, should be taken in curing love to extinguish every spark of hope in a lover. This advice is given with singular good sense and humanity by Dr. Gregory in his legacy to his daughters upon the subject of courtship and marriage. 7. Unsuccessful love is cured by exciting a more powerful passion in the mind. Ambition should be preferred for this purpose. Its efficacy is taken notice of by the Duke of Rochefoucauld. Ambition, he says, may succeed love, but love never cures ambition of grief. Physicians, in their unsuccessful efforts to save life, are often obliged to witness this passion. It is of consequence for them, therefore, to be well acquainted with its symptoms and cure. Its symptoms are acute and chronic. The former are insensibility, syncope, asphyxia, and apoplexy. The latter are fever, wakefulness, sighing, with and without tears, dyspepsia, hypochondriasis, loss of memory, gray hairs, marks of premature old age in the countenance, catalepsy, and madness. It sometimes brings on sudden death without any signs of previous disease, either acute or chronic. Dissections of persons who have died of grief show congestion in and inflammation of the heart with a rupture of its auricles and ventricles. But there are instances in which the sympathy of the heart with the whole system is so completely dissevered by grief that the subject of it discovers not one mark of it in his countenance or behavior. On the contrary, he sometimes exhibits signs of unbecoming levity in his intercourse with the world. This state of mind soon passes away and is generally followed by all the obvious and natural signs of the most poignant and durable grief. There is another symptom of grief, which is not often noticed, and that is profound sleep. I have often witnessed it even in mothers immediately after the death of a child. Criminals, we are told by Mr. Ackerman, the keeper of Newgate in London, often sleep soundly the night before their execution. The son of General Custine slept 9 hours the night before he was led to the guillotine in Paris. DFEC facts, and many similar ones that might be mentioned, will serve to vindicate the disciples of our Savior from a want of sympathy with him in his suffering. They slept during his agony in the garden because their flesh was weak, and in consequence of sorrow having filled their hearts. The remedies for grief are physical and moral. To enumerate the latter would be foreign to the design of these inquiries. They belong, moreover, to another profession. I shall barely glance at them without separating them from those that are of a physical nature. The first remedy that is indicated in recent grief is opium. It should be given in liberal doses in its first paroxysm, and it should be repeated afterwards in order to obviate wakefulness. From the relief which the discharge of tears affords in grief, pains should be taken to procure it. The means for this purpose are obtruding upon the mind a sorrow of a less grade than that by which it is depressed. Ancient history furnishes us with a pathetic example of the efficacy of this remedy. Samanitas, one of the kings of Egypt, with his son, daughter, and servant, were taken prisoners by Cambyses, king of Persia. Soon after his captivity, he beheld his daughter set in the habit of a servant to draw water. This sight drew tears from his attendants, but produced no sign of distress in the king of Egypt. Immediately afterwards, his son was conducted before his eyes to a place of execution. This sight he likewise saw without an emotion of any kind. His servant next appeared before him among a number of other captives. This sight, although accompanied with less distress than the two former, overcame him, and he suddenly burst into tears. It has been said that sorrows seldom come alone. The goodness of heaven is obvious in this dispensation of the evils of life. For as sorrows generally differ in their degrees, such of them as are great, by weakening sensibility, lessen the pain from the pressure of successive lighter ones, while such as are originally light prepare the mind for the pressure of such as exceed them. 3. Should the system react and symptoms of great excitement appear in the blood vessels or brain, bleeding and purges should be prescribed. The latter will be rendered necessary by the exhibition of opium. 4. The persons afflicted with grief should be carried from the room in which their relations have died, nor should they ever see their bodies after. They should by no means be permitted to follow them to the grave. It would be useful to enter the body of the deceased as far as possible from the view of their person, who is the subject of grief. Graveyards in a city and in places of public resort are very improper, inasmuch as they either renew and perpetuate grief, or create insensibility to death and a criminal indifference to human dust. The patriarch Abraham understood these principles in the human heart. Hence we read, when his wife died, he refused to bury her in the sepulchres of the sons of Heth, but entreated them to sell him a piece of ground, that he might bury her out of his sight. A similar practice was adopted by the descendants of this patriarch, who inhabited ancient Judea. Their graveyards were always placed 2,000 cubits from their cities. The sepulchres or vaults of the wealthy were in their gardens, which were situated in the neighborhood of their cities. These facts will render not only more credible, but more intelligible the account given in the New Testament of the agony of our Savior being in a garden near the city of Jerusalem, and his tomb, a sepulchre in which no man had laid. The Chinese, like the Jews, enter their dead out of their cities. The Russians bury their dead after night, probably to prevent unnecessary grief. 5. As soon as the ceremonies and bustle of the funeral are over, persons afflicted with grief should be advised to receive the visits of their friends, of whom the physician should always be one. In their first visit to persons recently bereaved of their relations, they should imitate the conduct of Job's friends, who, after weeping for his losses and afflictions when they beheld him afar off, the sacred historian tells us, sat down with him upon the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and none spake a word to him, for they saw his grief was very great. Mr. Sterne has imitated, but not equaled, this delicate and affecting passage. In his history of his Uncle Toby, in his first visit to his brother after the death of his son, he sat down, says Sterne, in an armchair at the head of a bed in which his brother lay, and said nothing. There is science, as well as sympathy in this silence, for in this way grief most rapidly passes from the bosom of the sufferer into that of his friend. As soon as it is proper to begin a conversation with a person under the pressure of recent grief, such consolations should be suggested as are offered by reason and religion. Dr. Stonehouse, the physician and friend of the pious Mr. Harvey, made it a practice to send a copy of a little work entitled The Mourner, written by Dr. Grosvenor, to the friends of every patient he lost. It is an excellent book, and well calculated to compose the mind under this kind of affliction. A physician should listen to the history of the last stage of his patient's disease, and to the details of the appearances of the body after death. Much knowledge may be picked up in this way, which would otherwise perish, if any prejudice or mistake has taken place respecting his opinion of the nature of the disease of which his patient has died, or of the effects of any of his remedies. He may remove or correct them. By a visit thus paid and employed, a physician not only wards off any complaint of his want of skill, but increases the confidence of his patients in it, and often secures their attachment to him through his subsequent life. 6. After the expiration of the weeks of mourning, care should be taken never to mention the names of the deceased persons to any of their friends, nor to allude to anything that by means of association can revive their memories. The appearance of mirth and even cheerfulness should be avoided. They both often give not only pain but offense to a mind rendered exquisitely sensible by recent grief. Physicians are sometimes called upon to mention the deaths of relations to their patients. This should never be done at once. They should be first told that they were sick and in great danger, and the news of their death should not be communicated until after a second or third visit of fear. There are so much danger and evil in our world that the passion of fear was implanted in our minds for the wise and benevolent purpose of defending us from them. The objects of fear are of 2 kinds, reasonable. These are death and surgical operations, and the 2 unreasonable, these are thunder, darkness, ghosts, speaking in public, sailing, riding, certain animals, particularly cats, rats, insects, and the like. The effects of fear. When it acts suddenly upon the system are tremors, quick pulse, and respiration, globus hystericus, a discharge of pale urine, diarrhea, and sometimes an involuntary discharge of the FICs, aphonia, fever, convulsions, syncope, mania, epilepsy, asphyxia, death. Dr. Brambilla relates the case of a soldier in whom fear produced not only a fever, but a mortification from a blister on the leg, which destroyed his life. Besides these general effects of fear, it acts in a peculiar manner upon the hair of the head. 1, in causing it to stand perpendicular. This has been happily described by Virgil and Shakespeare. 2, in converting it suddenly to a gray or white color. And 3, in causing it to come out by the roots and to fall off the head. Of this Dr. Hutch informed me he knew an instance in a gentleman who was in Lisbon at the time of the great earthquake in 1755. Other effects of fear have been lately noticed. The earthquake, which took place on the shores of the Mississippi in December 1811, produced silence or great talkativeness, and moping stillness or constant motion in different people. The remedies for fear are physical, rational, and moral. And here, as in the preceding chapter, I shall only hint at the moral remedies and blend them with such as are of a rational and physical nature. Of the remedies for the reasonable objects of fear, the first object of fear under this head is death. Its remedies are 1, just opinions of the divine government, and of the relation we sustain to the great author of our being. These opinions may be best formed by reading the Scriptures, and such other books as derive their arguments for fortifying the mind against this fear from them, particularly the works of Dr. Sherlock and Mr. Drelincourt, both of which contain a treasure of knowledge and consolation upon this subject. 2, As much of the fear of death is produced by the dread of the pains which attend it, let us inform our patients that these pains are by no means universal, that they are less severe than the pains of many common diseases, from which there are daily recoveries, and that heaven has kindly furnished us with several remedies which remove or mitigate them. It is less distressing to die, says Mr. Pascal, than to think of death. This, I believe, is strictly true in most cases. 3. The recollection of frequent escapes from death. David met Goliath without fear when he recollected his escapes from his conflicts with a lion and a bear. Soldiers become brave in proportion to the number of battles they have survived. 4. The frequent meditation upon death. Dr. Horn mentions an instance of a man who was not only cured of the fear of death by setting a portion of time every day to meditate upon it, but the subject at length became agreeable to him. In this, as well as in many other instances, painful impressions upon the mind are upon a footing with painful impressions upon the body in being converted by repetition into such as are of a pleasurable nature. 5. Constant employment is an antidote to the fear of death, for fear, like vice, is the offspring of idleness. 6. We have an account of a method of obviating the fear of death from a public execution. In Miss Williams's history of the conduct of the Marquis de Châtelet and General Miranda during their confinement in Paris, and at a time when they expected every day to be led to the guillotine. They read books of history and science constantly when alone, and conversed upon no other subject when together, and although they were confined for 6 months in the same apartment, they never spoke to each other of their impending and expected fate, by which means they lessened the fear of it. This account was confirmed to me by General Miranda in his visit to this city a few years ago. Boys obviate fear in like manner by silence and passing by a graveyard, or by conversing upon subjects unconnected with death. It is not peculiar to the pas scion of fear to be increased by conversation. All the other passions are excited by it. 7. The fear of death is sometimes obviated by company in the last hours of life. Is not so difficult a thing to die, said Louis XIV on his deathbed. As I expected, Voltaire, who mentions this anecdote, endeavors to account for it by adding that all men die with composure or fortitude who die in company. The courage of soldiers is derived in a great degree from being surrounded by persons who will bear a testimony in its favor. 8. Music suspends the fear of death, hence its universal use in battle. Even noise of any kind dissipates fear, hence boys obviate it not only by silence when in company, but by whistling or hallooing when they pass by a graveyard alone after night. 9. Opium has a wonderful effect in lessening the fear of death. I have seen patients cheerful in their last moments from the operation of this medicine upon the body and mind. 10. The fear of a surgical operation may be very much lessened by previous company and a large dose of opium. Its pain may be mitigated by the gradual application of the knife and in tedious operations by short intermissions in the use of it. 2. Of the unreasonable objects of fear. These are 1. Thunder. The remedies for it are 1. Living in a house defended by a lightning rod. 2. Sitting in the middle of a room and remote from the doors and windows of a house not defended by a lightning rod. 3. A citizen of Philadelphia who was under the influence of this fear obviated it in a degree by closing the doors and windows of a room and sitting with a lighted candle in it. By this means he avoided the sight of the lightning and the anticipation of the noise of the thunder which usually follows it. 4. A lady of respectable character, formerly of this city, usually fainted with terror during the time of a thunder gust, and discovered by a livid countenance and cold and clammy sweats the signs of approaching death. She was apparently kept alive by pouring into her stomach 3 or 4 wine glasses of Jamaica spirits. It was remarkable she never was intoxicated by it, and that it was disagreeable to her all other times. 5. I crossed the Atlantic Ocean with a lady in whom an acute headache was always induced by thunder. It left her as soon as the thunder ceased. Her only remedies for it were quietness and silence. It is probable a large dose of laudanum taken upon the appearance of a thunder gust would have prevented this headache, as well as obviated the terror mentioned in the 2 preceding cases. more effectually than a close room artificially lighted, or a large quantity of ardent spirits. 2. The fear which is excited by darkness may easily be overcome by a proper mode of education in early life. It consists in compelling children to go to bed without a candle, or without permitting company to remain with them until they fall asleep. 3. The fear of ghosts should be prevented or subdued in early life by teaching children the absurdity and falsehood of all the stories that are fabricated by nurses upon that subject. 4. The fear from speaking in public was always obviated by Mr. John Hunter by taking a dose of laudanum before he met his class every day. 5. The fear from sailing, riding, and from certain animals and insects may all be cured by resolution. It should be counteracted in early life. The existence of it always shows a defective education. Peter the Great of Muscovy was born with a dread of water. He cured it by throwing himself headlong into a boat when obliged to cross a river. The horror he felt in doing this often induced syncope. He finally conquered his dread of water so as to cross seas in pursuit of the great objects which characterized his life and reign. In cases of sudden fear from any cause, holding the breath, coughing, or hawking often give immediate relief. They impart tone to the brain by promoting a determination of blood to it, and thus infuse vigor into the mind. To obviate fear from all its causes, great advantages will arise from creating countermotives in the mind. The fear of death in a battle is overcome by the powerful sense of glory or shame. The fear of the pain in operation, such as drawing a tooth in a child, is overcome by the expectation of receiving afterwards a piece of money and the prospect of all the pleasures it will procure. Great advantages may likewise be derived for the cure of fear by a proper application of the principle of association. A horse will seldom be moved by the firing of a gun or the beating of a drum. If he hear them for the first time while he is eating, nor will he start or retire from a wheelbarrow or a millstone, or any other object of that kind after being once or twice fed upon them. The same law of association may be applied in a variety of instances to the human mind, as well to the prevention as cure of fear. Of anger. This passion was implanted in the human mind for wise and useful purposes. Its exercises within certain limits are admitted in the Scriptures. It is only when it ascends to rage and fury, or when it is protracted into malice and revenge, that it becomes a sin and a disease. A morbid paroxysm of anger appears in a preternatural determination of blood to the brain, a turgescence of the blood vessels of the face, a redness of the eyes, an increased secretion of saliva, which is discharged by foaming at the mouth, great volubility or a total suppression of speech, agitations of the fists, stamping of the feet, uncommon bodily strength, convulsions, hysteria, bleeding at the nose, apoplexy, and death. Sometimes this disease appears with paleness, tremors, sickness at the stomach, quick respiration, puking, syncope, and asphyxia. It is in this case generally combined with fear, and hence arises the abstraction of blood from the brain, and its determination to other parts of the body. The remedies for anger, when it becomes a disease, divide themselves into two classes. Such as are proper during its paroxysms, and such as are proper in their intervals to prevent their recurrence. To the first head belong 1, a draught of cold water. This acts in 2 ways. As a sedative, and 2, by giving time for reflection. 2, cold water thrown over the whole body has in several instances cured a paroxysm of anger. It never fails to part 2 angry contending dogs. 3, silence. This should be observed by persons when they are disposed to excessive anger. If this be impracticable, let the angry person repeat the Lord's Prayer. Or, if he be indisposed to do this, let him count 20. The actions of the organs of speech employed in either will serve to convey off a portion of excitement from his mind, as well as to give time for the reflux of blood from the brain. 4th, the celebrated General Galvez, formerly of the Spanish army, made it a practice, when he felt himself disposed to be angry, to drink a bottle of claret. It instantly composed his mind, probably by overcoming a weak, morbid action, and producing agreeable and healthy excitement in his brain. A dose of laudanum would be a better remedy for this purpose. It could not fail of being effectual in anger attended with fear, and a determination of the blood to the stomach and viscera of the thorax too. The means of preventing the recurrence of anger should be 1. A milk and vegetable diet. Dr. Arbuthnot says he has seen an irascible diathesis perfectly cured by this remedy. 2. Avoiding speaking with a loud voice at all times, and especially when disposed to anger. 3. Avoiding the use of ardent and fermented liquors. They predispose to anger even where they do not intoxicate. 4. Bolognius says that fatigue and thirst predispose to anger. Hunger certainly has that effect. They should both therefore be carefully avoided by irascible persons. 5. Opposing to anger other passions which destroy it. Thetis, I remarked formerly, eradicated the anger of her son Achilles by exciting in his mind the passion of love. Fear has had the same effect. The threat and the dread of a severe punishment has often prevented it in schoolboys and servants. 6. The cultivation of the understanding has a great influence in destroying the predisposition to anger. Science of all kinds is useful for this purpose, but the mathematics possess this property in the most eminent degree. They produced that effect upon the temper of Sir Isaac Newton, of which the following instance is mentioned by one of his contemporaries. Upon seeing a large collection of papers on fire that contained the calculations of many years, in consequence of his little dog jumping upon his table and oversetting his candle upon them, he barely uttered the following words. "Oh, Diamond, Diamond, little dost thou know the mischief thou hast done thy master." I shall mention in another place an instance of one of his appetites being subdued in like manner by his mind being constantly occupied by mathematical and philosophical studies. I am disposed to ascribe more to those studies than to any others, from their extending a sedative and moral influence to all the passions. Mr. Farmer, one of the ministers of the Catholic Church in this city, informed me that demonstrating 2 or 3 propositions in Euclid before he retired to his closet for the purpose of devotion never failed to have that effect upon his mind. 7. It will be useful for persons subject to the criminal degrees of this passion to reflect that it is not only contrary to religion and morals, but to liberal manners. The term gentleman implies a command of this passion above all others. This emotion is attended sometimes with pain in the region of the heart, a change in the voice, tears, syncope, and death. Mr. Bruce mentions another psi emptom of excessive joy, and that is thirst, which he felt in a high degree when he reached the long-sought for head of the Nile. He gratified it, he tells us, by drinking the health of his sovereign, George III, and of his mistress, by a draught from the fountain of that celebrated river. Joy is most intense when it has been preceded by fear. Has designated this form of joy in his eloquent speech preserved by Mr. Jefferson in his notes upon Virginia, when he declares that he knew not the joy of fear. There are many instances upon record of death being induced by a sudden paroxysm of joy. The son of the famous Leibniz died from this cause upon his opening an old chest and unexpectedly finding in it a large quantity of gold. Joy, from the successful issue of political schemes or wishes, has often produced the same effect. Pope Leo X died of joy in consequence of hearing of a great calamity that had befallen the French nation. Several persons died from the same cause, Mr. Hume tells us, upon witnessing the restoration of Charles II to the British throne. And it is well known the doorkeeper of Congress died of an apoplexy from joy upon hearing the news of the capture of Lord Cornwallis and his army during the American Revolutionary War. During a paroxysm of joy, if it be attended with danger to life, a new emotion or passion should be excited, particularly terror, anger, fear, or grief. Perhaps the effusion of cold water might have that effect. The stimulus of artificial pain should likewise be tried. It should be of a nature calculated to produce the most prompt effects. The morbid state of joy should be prevented by imparting the news which we expect will create it, in a gradual manner and with the alloy of some unpleasant circumstances connected with joy, but produced by different causes, is laughter. It is a convulsive disease and sometimes induces a rupture of a blood vessel in the lungs, spleen, or brain. I have seen an instance of hemoptysis induced by it, which had a fatal issue. 2 sudden deaths are upon record from it, the one of Chrysippus, an ancient Greek philosopher, the other of a pope. It was induced in the latter while he was confined to his bed with a light indisposition by seeing a tame monkey put on a part of his pontifical robes. Excessive laughter, when not attended with these fatal effects, is often followed with a pain in the left side, hiccup, and low spirits. The remedies for a paroxysm of laughter should be fear, terror, or any other counter-impression. Pinching the body or the effusion of cold water over it is calculated to produce the same good effects. Laudanum seldom fails of relieving the pain, hiccup, and low spirits, which sometimes follow it. Of the morbid effects of envy, malice, and hatred, as envy is commonly the parent of malice and hatred, I shall make a few remarks upon it, and afterwards mention the combined effects of them all upon the body. Of this vice it may be truly asserted that it is deep-seated and always painful. Hence it has been said by an inspired writer to resemble rottenness in the bones, and by Lord Bacon to know no holidays. It is likewise a monopolizing vice. Alexander envied his successful generals, and Garrick was hostile to all the popular players of his day. It is moreover a parasital vice, for it not only emits its poison against its friends, but against the persons who, by the favors it has conferred upon those who cherish it, have become in one respect the authors of their being. And lastly, it possesses a polypus life. No kindness, gentleness, or generosity can destroy it. On the contrary, it derives fresh strength from every act which it experienced of any of them. It likewise survives and often forgives the resentment it sometimes occasions, but without ceasing to hate the talents, virtues, or personal endowments by which it was originally excited. Nor is it satiated by the apparent extinction of them in death. This is obvious from its so frequently opening the sanctuary of the grave and robbing the possessors of those qualities of the slender remains it had left them of posthumous fame. However devoid this vice and its offspring may be of remissions, they now and then appear in the form of paroxysms, which discover themselves in tremors, paleness, and a suffusion of the face with red blood. The face in this case performs the vicarious office which has lately been ascribed to the spleen, but their effects appear more frequently in slow fevers and in a long train of nervous diseases. Persons affected with them seldom acknowledge their true cause. A single instance only of this candor is mentioned by Dr. Tissot. He tells us he was once consulted by a gentleman who told him all his complaints were brought on by his intense and habitual hatred of an enemy. Many of the chronic diseases of high life and professional men, I have no doubt, are induced by the same cause. I once thought that medicine had not a single remedy in all its stores that could subdue or even palliate the diseases induced by the baneful passions that have been described, and that an antidote to them was to be found only in religion. But I have since recollected one and heard of another physical remedy that will at least palliate them. The first is frequent convivial society between persons who are hostile to each other. It never fails to soften resentments and sometimes to produce reconciliation and friendship. The reader will be surprised when I add that the second physical remedy was suggested to me by a madman in the Pennsylvania hospital. In conversing with him, he produced a large collection of papers, which he said contained his journal. "Here," said he, "I write down everything that passes in my mind, and particularly malice and revenge. In recording the latter, I feel my mind emptied of something disagreeable to it, just as a vomit epitizes the stomach of bile. When I look at what I have written a day or two afterwards, I feel ashamed and disgusted with it, and wish to throw it into the fire. I have no doubt of the utility of this remedy for envy, malice, and hatred. From its salutary effects in a similar case, a gentleman in this city informed me that after writing an attack for the press upon a person who had offended him, he was so struck with its malignity upon reading it that he instantly destroyed it. The French nobility sometimes cover the walls and ceiling of a room in their houses with looking glasses. The room thus furnished is called a boudoir. Did ill-natured people imitate the practice of the madman and the gentleman I have mentioned? By putting their envious, malicious, and revengeful thoughts upon paper, it would form a mirror that would serve the same purpose of pointing out and remedying the evil dispositions of the mind that the boudoirs in France serve, in discovering and remedying the defects in the attitudes and dress of the body to persons who are not ashamed, nor disgusted with the first sight of their malevolent effusions upon paper. The same advice may be given that Dr. Franklin gave to a gentleman who read part of a humorous satire which he had written upon the person and character of a respectable citizen of Philadelphia. After he had finished reading it, he asked the doctor what he thought of his publishing it. "Keep it by you," said the doctor, "for 1 year, and then ask me that question." The gentleman felt the force of this answer and went immediately to the printer who had composed the first page of it from him, and consigned the whole manuscript to oblivion. I shall conclude the history of the passions by remarking that their symptoms and force are varied by a difference in predisposition, age, rank in society, profession, moral and religious habits, duration, and by their acting singly or in combination with each other. There is now and then a torpor of the passions, the reverse of the diseases in them which have been described. Instead of being unduly excited, they are devoid of all sensibility and irritability. Persons who are thus affected love and fear nothing. They are strangers to grief and anger. They envy and hate nobody, and they are alike insensible to mental pleasure and pain. One was once consulted by a citizen of Philadelphia, who was remarkable for his strong affection for his wife and children when his mind was in a sound state, who was occasionally afflicted with this apathy, and when under its influence lost his affection for them all so entirely, that he said he could see them butchered before his eyes without feeling any distress, or even an inclination to rise from his chair to protect them. This paralytic state of all the passions continues during life in some people. A physician of great eminence who died some years ago in England declared upon his deathbed that he had never known what it was to love man, woman, or child. But we sometimes meet with this disorder in a partial state. Thus, there are men who have never loved, others who have never feared, others who have never shed a tear, and others in whom no injuries have ever excited an emotion of anger. In such persons, the mind is in a mutilated state. For man without all his passions is an imperfect being, both as to his duties and happiness. The remedies for this torpid state of the passions, whether general or partial, should be suited to the state of the system. Depletion will be proper if the blood vessels are oppressed. In a contrary state of the system, powerful stimulants, particularly pain, labor, the cold bath, and a salivation, are indicated. I mentioned formerly an instance in which mercury restored the affection of a mother for her child in a day or two after it affected her mouth. Chapter 20. Medical Inquiries and Observations upon the Diseases of the Mind. Chapter 18. Of the morbid state of the sexual appetite. This appetite, which was implanted in our natures for the purpose of propagating our species, when excessive, becomes a disease both of the body and mind. When restrained, it produces tremors, a flushing of the face, sighing, nocturnal pollutions, hysteria, hypochondriasis, and in women the furor uterinalis. When indulged in an undue or promiscuous intercourse with the female sex or in onanism, it produces seminal weakness, impotence, dysuria, tabes dorsalis, pulmonary consumption, dyspepsia, dimness of sight, vertigo, epilepsy, hypochondriasis, loss of memory, menalgia, fatuity, and death. From a number of letters addressed to me for advice, I shall select but 3, in which many of those symptoms are mentioned and deplored in the most pathetic terms. The first is from a physician in Massachusetts, dated September 4, 1793. The gentleman whose case is now submitted to you is about 25 years of age, meager, gloomy, and restless, has a bad countenance, and a lax state of bowels. He imputes his indisposition to his excessive devotedness to Venus, which he thinks has been induced by a morbid state of his body. He has been married 3 years, had no connection with the sex before he married, and although he feels disgusted with his strong venereal propensities, he cannot resist them. I advised him to separate himself from his wife By traveling, which he did, but without experiencing any relief from his disease, he has earnestly requested me to render him impotent if I could not give him the command of himself in any other way. I have tried several remedies in his case. Nothing has done him any good, except the sugar of lead, which I was soon obliged to lay aside from its producing a severe nervous colic. Wishing to know whether his disease was not seated in his imagination only, I asked whether the gratification of his appetite was equal to his desires. Dixit, perennos tre, quinque vices sequoitum facis in horis viginti quatuor, et semper semine ejecto. The second letter to which I have alluded is from the miserable subject of the disease that is described in it. After acknowledging its cause to be from onanism, he adds, I rest badly at nights, and am much troubled with dreams. I have frequent nocturnal erections accompanied with a sensation of uneasiness instead of desire or pleasure, and from dreams frequent emissions take place, which are much more fluid than natural. The external organs of generation have a numb or dead feeling. The lower part of my back is weak. My eyes are often painful and my eyelids swelled and red. I have an almost constant cold and oppression at my stomach. In short, I had rather be laid in the silent tomb and encounter that dreadful uncertainty hereafter than remain in my present unhappy and degraded situation. These are humiliating concessions, and it is extremely painful for me to make them. But let my melancholy situation be my apology for them. The third and last letter upon this subject is from a physician in Virginia, in which he describes the disease of a patient then under his care in the following words. A.B., aged 17, of a cold, phlegmatic temperament of body, of a sedentary life and studious habits, in consequence of indulging in the solitary vice of onanism, has lately become very much diseased. His vision is indistinct, and his memory much impaired, and he now labors under much muscular relaxation, prostration of strength, atrophy, and depression of spirits. His system is so very irritable that the least agitation of mind, or riding on horseback, or gently rubbing his breast, or even combing his hair, are similis or nem inducant. Any plan you may suggest for the relief of this truly wretched being will be gratefully received. But these are not all the melancholy and disgusting effects of excess in the indulgence of the sexual appetite. They sometimes discover themselves in the imagination and senses, in a fondness for obscene conversation and books, and in a wanton dalliance with women, long after the ability to gratify the appetite has perished from disease or age. The remote and exciting causes of this disease in the sexual appetite are, 1. Excessive eating, more especially of high-seasoned animal food. The vices of the cities of the plain were derived in part from their fullness of bread, by which is meant an excess of nourishing element. 2. Intemperance in drinking, hence the frequent transition from the bottle to the brothel. It is because it is so common and natural that the former is generally mentioned as an apology for the disease contracted in the latter by young men in their application to physicians for remedies for it. The incestuous gratification of the sexual appetite, which was the first sin that revived in the world after the flood, was the effect, we are told, of the intemperate use of wine. 3. Idleness. This was another of the causes mentioned in the Old Testament of the vices of the cities of the plain. It is from the effects of indolence and sedentary habits that the venereal appetite prevails with so much force, and with such odious consequences within the walls of those seminaries of learning, in which a number of young men are herded together and lodge in the same rooms or in the same beds. The remedies for this appetite, when inordinate, are natural, physical, and mental. They are 1. Matrimony. But where this is not practicable, the society of chaste and modest women. While men live by themselves, says Labertière, they do not view washerwomen or oyster wenches as washerwomen or oyster wenches, but simply as women. But by mixing with the sex, they lose the habit of associating the idea of the sex of the woman with a cap or a petticoat. I have known few young men of loose morals who have attached themselves to the society of the ladies. They not only polish their manners, but purify their imaginations. 2. A diet, consisting simply of vegetables, and prepared without any of the usual condiments that are taken with them. Dr. Stark found his venereal desires nearly extinguished by living upon bread and water. They revived upon a diet of bread and milk, and became more active by eating 6 or 8 ounces of roasted goose every day, with a proportionable quantity of bread. Persons afflicted with this disease should use but little salt in their aliment. Plutarch tells us, it was avoided by the priests in his day from its disposing to venery. The birth of Venus from the sea was probably intended to signify the connection between the use of salt and the venereal appetite. In recommending a vegetable diet for the cure of this disease, I would remark that it is effectual only when it succeeds a full animal diet, for we read not only of individuals but of whole nations that live upon vegetables and other simple food, in whom the sexual appetite exists in its usual and natural force. In such persons, the appetite should be weakened by reducing the quantity of their aliment. Temperance in drinking, or rather the total abstinence from all fermented and distilled liquors. 4. Constant employment in bodily labor or exercise. They both lessen venereal excitability and promote healthy excitement. Hippocrates tells us the Scythians, who nearly lived upon horseback, were free from venereal desires. Long journeys on horseback should therefore be recommended for the morbid degrees of this appetite. The chase would probably serve the same purpose. The connection between this exercise and chastity is happily illustrated by the poets in the character of Diana, who lived by hunting. The Indians owe the weakness of their venereal desires to this, among other invigorating employments. 5. The cold bath. There is a debility of body which is connected with venereal excitability, and which the cold bath is calculated to remove. This excitability is most apt to occur during the convalescence, or soon after the recovery from each EV malignant or chronic fevers. 12 marriages took place of the patients who recovered from the yellow fever at Bush Hill. In the neighborhood of this city in the year 1793, and a greater number were detected in a criminal intercourse with each other in the private apartments and tents belonging to the hospital. I have known 2 instances of young clergymen who married the women who nursed them in chronic fevers, both of whom were in very humble lives. The celebrated Mr. Howard did the same thing. These unequal matches appear to have been the effects of a morbid sexual appetite that suddenly succeeded their fevers, and which they did not dare to gratify, but in a lawful way. 6. A salivation, by diverting morbid excitability from the genitals to the mouth and throat, would probably be useful in this disease. 7. Avoiding all dalliance with the female sex. I knew a gentleman in this city who assured me he had gained a complete victory over his venereal desires by a strict regard to this direction. And I have heard of a clergyman who overcame this appetite by never looking directly in the face of a woman. 8. Avoiding the sight of obscene pictures, the reading obscene books, and listening to obscene conversation, all of which administer fuel to the sexual appetite. 9. Certain tones of music have sometimes suddenly relieved a paroxysm of venereal desires. 10. Dr. Boerhaave says a sudden fit of laughter has sometimes had the same effect. 11. Close application of the mind to business or study of any kind, more especially to the mathematics. Sir Isaac Newton conquered this appetite by means of the latter study, and the late Dr. Fothergill by constant application to business. Both these great and good men lived and died bachelors, and both declared upon their deathbeds that they never had known, in a single instance, a criminal connection with the female sex. 12. The influence of an active passion that shall predominate over the sexual appetite, the love of military glory, so common among the American Indians, by combining with the hardships of a savage life, contributes very much to weaken their venereal desires. 13. Several medicines have been recommended to subdue the excess of the sexual appetite. Among these, the castor oil nut and camphor have been most commended. The former acts only by opening the bowels, and thereby taking off the tension of the contiguous genital organs. Any other lenient purge would probably have the same effect. If camphor have any virtues in this disease, it must be by its stimulating powers, removing that nervous debility upon which venereal excitability depends. Any other stimulating medicine given in a similar state of the system would probably have the same, or a greater effect. One has thus mentioned all the remedies for derangement in the passions and sexual appetite. While I admit the necessity of their being aided by religious influence, in order to render them successful, I maintain that religious influence is seldom effectual for that purpose, unless it be combined with those physical remedies. This opinion is amply supported by numerous precepts in the Old and New Testament, and it is only by inculcating those physical precepts with such as are of a religious and moral nature, that the latter can produce their full effects upon the body and mind. Chapter 21. Medical Inquiries and Observations upon the Diseases of the Mind. Chapter 19 of Derangement in the Moral Faculties. In the will, it mentioned its symptoms as they appear in several specific vices. This disease discovers itself only in the moral faculty, and exists with a sound state of the conscience and sense of deity. Under the present head, I shall make a few remarks upon moral derangement as it appears in all those moral faculties of the mind. For an account of the nature and offices of the moral faculty and conscience, and of the difference between them, the reader is referred to an oration delivered by the author before the American Philosophical Society in the year 1786, and published in the first volume of his Medical Inquiries and Observations. For proofs of the existence of an innate sense of deity in the human mind, the reader is referred to Lord Kames' sketches of the history of man. All these faculties are liable to derangement, partially and universally. Partial derangement in them is sometimes induced, 1. by ardent spirits, 2. by famine, the effects of which in annihilating the obligations, not only of morality, but of consanguinity and inducing the grossest acts of cruelty, are recorded in the 56th and 57th verses of the 28th chapter of Deuteronomy. The consonance of the prediction contained in those verses with the state of the human mind in similar circumstances of distress from hunger has been established in many instances in the histories of crews who have sought relief from shipwreck in a boat or on a desolate shore. 2. The moral faculty, conscience, and the sense of deity are sometimes totally deranged. The Duke of Sully has given us a striking instance of this universal moral derangement in the character of a young man who belonged to his suit, of the name of Servin, who after a life uncommonly distinguished by every possible vice, died. Cursing and denying his God, Mr. Halsam has described 2 cases of it in the Bethlehem Hospital, one of whom, a boy of 13 years of age, was perfectly sensible of his depravity, and often asked why God had not made him like other men. He was, as might be expected, completely miserable, and often expressed a wish for death. An epitome of all that has been recorded, or perhaps seen, of this derangement in the moral faculties has been given by Edgar of himself in the tragedy of King Lear in the following line. For I was a serving man, proud in heart and mind, that served the lust of my mistress' heart, and did the act of darkness with her, swore as many oaths as I spake words. Wine I loved deeply, dice dearly I was false of heart, light of ear and bloody of hand, hog in filth, fox in stealth, wolf in greediness, dog in madness, and lion in prey. In the course of my life, I've been consulted in 3 cases of the total perversion of the moral faculties. One of them was in a young man, the second in a young woman, both of Virginia, and the third was in the daughter of a citizen of Philadelphia. The last was addicted to every kind of mischief. Her wickedness had no intervals while she was awake, except when she was kept busy in some steady and difficult employment. 3.08 on the diseases in all these cases of innate preternatural moral depravity. There is probably an original defective organization in those parts of the body which are occupied by the moral faculties of the mind. How far the persons whose diseases have been mentioned should be considered as responsible to human or divine laws for their actions, and where the line should be drawn that divides free agency from necessity and vice from disease, I am unable to determine. In whatever manner this question may be settled, it will readily be admitted that such persons are, in a preeminent degree, objects of compassion, and that it is the business of medicine to aid both religion and law in preventing and curing their moral alienation of mind. We are encouraged to undertake this enterprise of humanity by the sameness of the laws which govern the body and the moral faculties of man. I shall venture to point out the sameness of those laws in a few instances by mentioning the predisposition and proximate causes, the symptoms and the remedies of corporeal and moral diseases. Is debility the predisposing cause of disease in the body? So it is a vice in the mind. This debility in the mind consists in indolence or a want of occupation. Bunyan has justly said in support of this remark that an idle man's brain is the devil's workshop. The young woman, whose moral derangement I mentioned a little while ago, was always inoffensive when she was busy. The employment contrived for her by her parents was to mix 2 or 3 papers of pins of different sizes together, and afterwards to oblige her to separate and sort them. The near relation of debility and vice has been expressed by the schoolman in the following words: non posse est malum posse. To do nothing is generally to do evil. Do we prevent disease by removing the body out of the way of exciting causes acting upon debility? In like manner, we prevent vice by removing the mind in its debilitated state out of the way of bad company, and thus abstract it from the stimulus of vicious motives upon the will. Does bodily disease consist in morbid excitement or irregular action? Vice consists in like manner in undue excitement of the passions and will, and in their irregular, or to use a scriptural epithet, in their crooked actions. 4. Is bodily disease a unit? So is vice. All its innumerable forms are derived simply from inordinate self-love. 5. Do high degrees of morbid bodily excitement require depleting remedies? High degrees of vice require remedies of a similar nature, such as the abstraction of company and the excessive or criminal gratification of the passions and senses. 6. Do we overcome morbid action in a bodily disease in a highly vital part by exciting it in a part less essential to life? In like manner, we cure the odious vice of avarice and a debasing love of pleasure by the less odious and debasing vice of ambition. 7. Is it impossible to produce 2 sensations of unequal force at the same time in the body? It is equally impossible for the mind to act under the impression of 2 motives at the same time. Hence the truth of that declaration of our Savior that no man can serve 2 masters. That is God and Mammon. The predominance of the motive excited by one of them will always destroy the other. 8. Do we accommodate stimuli to the state of excitability and diseases of the body? The same thing is done in all the successful applications of moral stimuli or motives to the will. Our Savior hints at this accommodation of moral remedies to the peculiar state of the mind when he alludes to the practice of not putting new wine, full of an active fermenting principle, into old bottles, which, in ancient Judea, were made of leather and of course became weak from age. 9. Is the excessive morbid excitement of a disease worn down by labor? Excessive vicious excitement is reduced in like manner by the same means, and, in addition to it, by solitude, shame, and certain restraints or pains inflicted upon the body of a nature calculated to act indirectly upon the mind. I acknowledge the first impressions of confinement and bodily pain generally produce a vicious fretfulness, and sometimes impious expressions and immoral conduct, but these effects of those moral remedies are generally very transient. When continued long enough, they never fail of producing a change in the moral temper of the mind. A remarkable instance of the truth of this remark occurred some years ago in the jail of Philadelphia. A notorious offender amused himself for some time after his confinement by drawing pictures and writing verses of a ludicrous nature upon the walls of his solitary cell. At the end of several weeks, he became silent and pensive, and at the same time, the following passage of Scripture, written by him, was discovered upon one of the walls of his cells. Come unto me, all ye who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. 10. Are bodily sensibility and irritability weakened or destroyed by the protracted application of morbid stimuli to sensible and irritable parts? The same thing takes place from the long application of vicious impressions to the moral faculties of the mind. They become in such cases, to use the words of one of the apostles, Kiti dead, and see red with a red-hot iron. A disease resembling a palsy affects them all. I might go on further and mention, more particularly, the analogy between bodily and moral diseases, and the propriety of adapting specific remedies to specific vices. But enough, I hope, has been said to show the truth and importance of the subject and the practicability of the undertaking by persons whose professional studies and employments are more nearly related to it than the authors. However useful the rational and physical remedies that have been mentioned may be to prevent or cure vice, they never can perform that work completely without the aid of that supernatural and mysterious remedy which it hath pleased God to unite with them in his moral government of his creatures, and that is the forgiveness of it. In vain have legislators substituted the exterminating axe and halter, and the influence of ignominious or painful corporeal punishments for this divine mode of curing moral evil. The danger and mortality of the venereal disease were increased in former times by the contempt, neglect, and corporeal chastisement to which persons affected with it were exposed. Since the pain and shame of the disease have been considered as its ample punishments, and the subjects of it restored to public favor, the disease has everywhere declined, and is now rarely attended with danger or the loss of life. The abolition of the punishment of death, and of cropping, branding, and public whipping, and then substituting for them confinement, labor, simple diet, cleanliness, and affectionate treatment as means of reformation and forgiveness, have produced similar moral effects in the jail of Philadelphia. If this original and humane institution, in which science and religion have blended their resources together, has not been attended with uniform success, it must be ascribed wholly to the imperfect mariner with which the principles that suggested it have been carried into effect. They have been rendered abortive chiefly by the criminals sleeping in the same room, and by the facility and frequency with which pardons are obtained for them. The former prevents the resuscitation of conscience and all moral and religious reflection. The latter is opposed to the great axioms upon which the penal law of Pennsylvania is founded, that punishment should be certain but not severe, and that a pardoning power should not be lodged in any department of a government. May this Christian system of criminal jurisprudence be spread, without any of its imperfections, throughout the world. And may the rulers of nations learn from it that the reformation of criminals, as well as the prevention of crimes, should be the objects of all punishments, and that the latter can be effected much better by living than by dead examples. Here the reader and the author must take leave of each other. Before I retire from his sight, I shall only add, if I have not advanced agreeably to my wish the interests of medicine by this work, I hope my labors in the cause of humanity will not be alike unsuccessful, and that the sufferings of our fellow creatures from the causes that have been mentioned may find sympathy in the bosoms, and relief from the kindness of every person who shall think it worth while to read this history of them. The end.